So here I am once again cooking up a storm. Today I'm making some chicken teriyaki. It's currently marinating in the teriyaki sauce. I think I used a little more than I needed to for the marinade, but whatever. Better to use too much than too little, I say. Oven's just getting warmed up, and once again I'm in this room wandering around wearing the same socks while the oven is heating up, talking once again about how people interpret art. So, without further ado, let's get this show on the road. Let's talk about this, because I think I found a better way to explain what I was trying to say last time. I think some better phrasing for my point about art and interpretation. So, oops, wrong lid. So if someone says that they enjoy a piece of art, they think an art piece is good. What they're saying is that their interpretation resonates with them. Okay, so you can never judge an art piece objectively, in my opinion. I mean, some people seem to have this strange idea that art is something that's objective and there's objectively good and objectively bad art, which I heavily disagree with. But I'll get into that in a bit. So, if someone says that an art piece is good, what they mean is their interpretation of that art piece resonates with them, right? So the way that they interpret it, obviously, this is also completely irrelevant from authorial intent. Authorial intent never plays into this for a second. What matters is that the art piece stands on its own, and how do you interpret it? Sometimes it can be influenced by what you've heard of the author's intent, but that only happens of what you've heard, and that is also subject to interpretation. So it's all about interpretation and resonance. Now, if two people disagree, there's two reasons that they might disagree. Either they disagree on the interpretation, or they have different resonances. Either me and you see the same art piece, and our interpretations of the art piece are different. Therefore, obviously, what we think of it are going to be different. Or we interpret it the same way, but because of our differences as individuals, for one person it resonates, for the other person it doesn't resonate. These are the only reasons, these are the only opinions you can have about art. There is no other way to experience art. You have to have some sort of interpretation, and that interpretation has to either resonate or not resonate with you. This is the only way you can form any opinion on art. Now, why may an interpretation resonate? Well, interpretations are based on empirical facts. There is something that you are experiencing. There is an art there that you are experiencing. Now, your opinion on that art may be subjective, but the art itself that exists is objective. I don't know. I'm here. Let's wander around and pick up this CD, for example. What's this? Okay, this is Gregory Porter, Liquid Spirit. This is a pretty decent album. Actually, I'm going to use ABBA because ABBA is more of a comical example. So, whatever you think of this album, this ABBA album, the album is the same. We all experience the same album. It's our interpretations or our resonances that are different. Now, there's two reasons that your interpretation could be different. Either you are it could either be influenced by your own individuality, like your life experiences. For example, let's say this ABBA album. My mum used to always play it when I was growing up, so that plays into my interpretation of the album. It's a nostalgic album for me because I had it around the house constantly when I was a young child. There's a good example. Or it could be because of a lack of information, or certain information you've noticed, or certain information that you may not have noticed. For example, this ABBA album isn't such a good example of this. Let me think of something else. Let's say, I don't know, Syria Experiments Lane, because there's a lot of, everyone knows that show is open to interpretation massively, and there's a lot of metaphors and symbolism and all that good shit, right? Now, you may just miss something, and that's not a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with that, that you may have just missed something when you're watching that show. Then it's generally what's the word? It's generally accepted you have to watch it 4 times before you truly understand the show, right? Because there's so much that you could miss. Now, This is where the criticism happens, because if you and I disagree on something, and it's because you are missing a piece of evidence, then that is when I can come in and say, no, you're wrong, because you're missing a piece of evidence, and then I can explain this piece of evidence. However, if both of us are working with the same evidence, right, then the only differences can be in interpretation and resonance, right? So then it's a matter of personal opinion, basically. The only way it can be objective is if you're missing evidence, if you've missed something. Now, this is where it gets complicated, because sometimes evidence is also subjective. To bring it back to Serial Experiments Lain, since I just love using this as an example for everything, right? Let's take any scene, right? You could say, I don't know, just pops into my head. In the first episode, there's one shot where Lain looks down on her shadow and her shadow is full of smoke. The evidence is right there. Two people seeing that evidence may completely disagree on whether it is relevant or not. Some people may say that's purely an aesthetic. But yeah, the evidence is there, and I agree that the evidence is there. But that evidence shows that it's purely aesthetic. Whereas another person might see the same evidence and say, this evidence is clearly a visual metaphor for Lain's turbulent mental state, or her dissociation from everything going on around her. The smoke is inside her shadow, which represents the sort of vapor, the transient nature of her personality, the uncertain and formless nature of her on the inside, because the smoke is on the inside of her shadow. Or what is kind of liquidy smoke. I'm not sure how to describe that effect, but it looks cool as fuck. Now, these two people are both right, but they're also both wrong, because whether or not and also, this is the other thing, the author could come along and say, no, I just put that there to look cool. Your interpretation's wrong, I just put that there to look cool. Does that make that person's interpretation any less valid? No, it doesn't, because it still resonates with them in a certain way, and the way they interpret it is what affects that resonance, right? So the evidence can be subjective, because one person might read into something that is or isn't there, or isn't intentional. Imagine, if you will, a famous film. We'll call it The Dawn of Flumbus. So there's this film called The Dawn of Flumbus, and it's it's a famous film for being great metaphor and the first example of metatextuality in cinema. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. I'm making this example up. And let's say in this film, something that critics talk about all the time is the way that this film utilizes a realistic film burn to drive home the point. You know how, like, in Undertale, the game crashes on purpose at some point, and it's like a sort of meta thing? That sort of thing, right? So all these critics are talking about how that's amazing, and then suddenly some new evidence comes to light that is actually just a real mistake in the filming process. Okay? Now your evidence is subjective, because you've been working with the wrong evidence this whole time. Now, can I say your interpretation is wrong because of that? Can I say everyone who thought that this film was so great because of the metatextuality of that part is incorrect because it was actually not on purpose? No, because art doesn't come from what the creator says it comes from. And even if you have that evidence, the creator chose to leave it in. Whether consciously or subconsciously, you can't draw the line. I know this is just basic death of the author stuff that people have talked about a million times, but it's incredibly interesting to me as someone who is constantly making art. Oh look, my oven is heated. Yeah, this stuff is really interesting to me. Why the fuck am I looking in there? I'm such an idiot sometimes. Yeah. This stuff's really interesting to me because I think about this all the time. And in my... so I'm releasing a new album in February. It's called No Thank You Doesn't Laugh. And it's, it plays with a lot of these elements. I don't want to give anything away too much before the album comes out. But it plays with these elements of metatextuality, and it's highly open to interpretation. My previous album... Volume 2, the lyrics are very straightforward. The songs are incredibly straightforward. There's one or two songs that have a little bit more of a hidden meaning in them, but in general, that album is relatively surface surface level of interpretation. If you read the lyrics, you can pretty much understand what the songs are about in pretty much every case. Take Hakey Punk, for example. All the lyrics in that song it tells a continuous narrative. It makes perfect sense. It's internally consistent, right? But now, if you take a listen to my new album, you won't find that sort of thing, because the songs aren't made to stand on their own without context. These songs are made to exist within the world, and therefore they're going to be much more open to interpretation from other people. So I am worried, because the evidence is there, but the evidence doesn't just exist within the work. The evidence for my art exists in the entirety of culture, the entire cultural zeitgeist of the moment. So I'm worried, will people have a interpretation that is conducive to a positive reading, a nice resonance of my art? Or did I go too far in having evidence exist without the art itself? Did I go too far, or will it work? This is the question. I don't want to seem like because if I go around saying, oh, you just don't get it, you just don't get it, that's not your fault. That's my fault. I didn't do a good enough job of explaining it. If most people don't get it, then you as an artist need to think about why that is, and think about whether you care about that, first of all. If you're accusing people, oh, you just don't get it, then it means that you are saying that's a bad thing. If people not getting it is the point of it, then that's fine. But then you don't need to point that out to people. You can just sort of let it sit. So if you don't care about that stuff, that's different. But in this case, I care about people understanding it, because I'm saying things that are important to me, and I want to get, this album is a communication. So if people don't get it, quote unquote, get it, right? If people don't understand what I was going for, that's not their fault. That is my fault for not communicating as well as I should have. Now, I've tried my best. I've spent a long time refining this communication, trying to get it down so the message, the main thrust of the album is clear, right? It may even be too clear. In my eyes, it's too clear. But I really want people to understand what I was going for, so I've made it quite obvious. Again, no spoilers. But yeah. Also, I forgot to time this, so I need to put a timer on immediately. Let's do that now. So this is why I'm so obsessed with this question right now, because it plays into my art right now. This is a very important thing for me as of now. This is something that I'm thinking about constantly, because I am making this album and it's almost done. February 1st, by the way. That I need some way, like I need to understand how this works in order to make it work the best in my own art. Now, I might be completely wrong about my interpretation of how interpretation works. And if I am, please comment your ideas in the comments, because I'm very interested to hear how other people think about this sort of thing. But I'm pretty sure I got to the root of the problem, or the root of the whole thing. How it's all about evidence, interpretation, and resonance. You have the evidence, which exists the same for everybody, hopefully, sometimes not hopefully. In the case of, I just gave an example with ABBA, right? The evidence that is the album is also, for me, informed by the evidence of nostalgia, having it around when I was a child. So there you go. There's an example of how evidence can be subjective. But in general, the evidence is mostly the same. If you're talking about just the text and not the zeitgeist and the meta text, the text itself is the same for everyone. Then you have people's interpretations of the text. When you absorb a text, when you experience anything, you can't not interpret it, because it has to go through your brain, and your brain is a filter. It has to go through your senses. Your senses are a filter. It's automatically interpreted, whether you want it to be or not. And the third part is entirely subjective. If the first part wasn't already subjective enough, resonance is entirely subjective. Me and you may agree entirely on what a show does, but for one person, you might say, yeah, that's awesome, and for another person, you might say, nah, that's terrible. for example, I mean, I had that video about Monogatari where I saw someone saying that the directing in Monogatari was just flashy for no reason. Well, or the flashy directing took away from the story is what I'm trying to say. It was distracting. Whereas for me, that resonates with me. Even though we came from the same evidence, we both saw Monogatari. We basically both interpreted it very similar. There was some minor differences, but we interpreted it basically the same. But our resonances were completely different. This person I was talking to, this person on Twitter, saw the same flashy directing that's in the same Akiyuki Shinbo Shaft directing style, and it didn't resonate with them. They thought it took away from the story. Whereas when I saw it, it heavily resonated with me, and I thought it added to the story. So every part of it is what can go wrong or right with an art form. And there is my point, basically. That is what I'm trying to say. Remember to give me Patreon money, because I'm broke. And, but this is the thing, okay? My Patreon is not a donation service. It's you pay for a product. Because my albums are free for everyone, but I can't do that forever. After a certain amount of free downloads, Bandcamp charges you to keep it up there if you want to keep it free, or it makes you make it not free, right? So in order for me to keep my main releases free, I have to have an income. But even that is not, so already that's a transaction. But even that is not enough transaction for me. My Patreon is, you pay me $1 or more a month, and I give you back, like, tit for tat, I give you back 5 tracks. It's incredibly simple transaction. You're paying for the tracks. I want to make this clear because it's not a donation service for me. It is a purchase. It is a transaction. You're purchasing a good, and the good is my art. There you go. And as well as being a patron in the more classic sense of the word, where you enjoy my art, so you're funding it so that more can exist. That's more of an investment. Whereas this, it's both, which is why I am happy with my business model right now, because this way of funding is both an investment and a transaction in the moment, which I am a pretty big fan of. And I think all I'm saying is, if I was looking at myself from the outside, I would donate, and that is I say donate. If I was looking at myself from the outside, then I would be inclined to Patreon. I don't really know if that appeals to other people, if that sort of thing is the sort of thing that other people care about, but I can't judge other people. Really, the only person I can know is myself, and even then, it's sketchy at best. But that's how I'm trying to make my Patreon, and I hope that appeals to people, because people there's certain people out there that they just want money for doing nothing, and that's fine, but people money is a finite resource for the vast majority of the world, and if someone's going to be spending their money, which they've probably worked pretty hard on in general, I want them to get their bang for their buck, the maximum bang for their buck. That was a little tangent about my Patreon at the end of that video. I hope I didn't come across as too shilly. I'm not trying to say that because I particularly am saying it's a moral good to donate to my Patreon. I'm just trying to explain my philosophy of it. Anyway, there you go. That's the video.